Hi everyone, my name is Mila Mileva, and today I'm really happy to be able to share some of my work on first impressions from Faces and Voices with you as part of the Comparative Aesthetics Symposium. Now, there's already a vast literature on first impressions, so we know quite a bit about them. We know that first impressions are formed extremely quickly, within a few milliseconds. We know that people tend to agree with each other's impressions, which is what allows us to systematically investigate them. We also know that first impressions can have a really wide range of consequences, from dating preferences to political elections and even court sentencing decisions. And we know that there are generally two or three main underlying dimensions in social evaluation, which are trustworthiness, dominance, and attractiveness. And finally, perhaps the most relevant point for the present work is that impressions formed from both the human face and the human voice share most of these key properties. But despite everything that we already know, there are still steps that we can take to get a little closer to how first impressions are formed in everyday life. For example, the majority of the literature on face perception tends to represent human beings a bit like this, with images that are very strictly controlled, where we all have the same blank, neutral emotional expression, same clothing, same lighting, and so on. But in reality, we're actually a bit more like this. We show different emotional expressions, different poses, different angles, and so on. And the same is true for linguistics research on identity perception, where many studies use a very simple vowel pronunciation or backward speech rather than real, contentful utterances that are actually relevant to the purposes of the study. And what is more, the general tendency is to take different aspects of identity, so say a face and a voice, and investigate their independent effects in isolation, rather than consider how all of these cues are integrated together in order to represent reality a bit more accurately. Of course, both of these approaches have their advantages and disadvantages, and we need both of them in order to get the full picture. But while there are already many studies taking this more strictly controlled approach, there really aren't enough taking this more natural route. So, this is where some of my work comes in. And today we will try and use this more natural approach to try and address three important questions. The first one is about audiovisual integration in first impressions and the relative contribution of face and voice cues to the perception of the main underlying traits, so trustworthiness, dominance, and attractiveness. We'll then explore audiovisual integration a bit further and test whether face and voice cues are automatically integrated together. And finally, we'll take a look at the variability in first impression ratings attributed to both different images or voice recordings of the same person. So for the first study, we ask how information from the human face and the human voice are integrated together when we form a first impression. To address this question, we used a pre-rated set of images that contained multiple images for each identity. And for each person, we chose 6 different images. So the ones that received the lowest and the highest ratings of trustworthiness, dominance, and attractiveness. And you can see some examples on the screen here. So the first row is all images of the same person, and so is the second row, all images of the same person. And then for each identity, we have the least and the most trustworthy image, the least and the most dominant, the least and the most attractive image as well. All images were ambient, naturally varying, that resemble the images that we encounter in everyday life a bit better. These images were then paired with natural voice recordings that were matched for age and gender. And to try and manipulate the perception of the three traits, we used differences in vocal pitch. So for each person, we had a recording with a higher pitch and a recording with a lower pitch. This approach was successful for dominance and attractiveness, where voices with a lower pitch, both for male and female identities, were perceived as more dominant and more attractive. And here are a couple of examples. So this is higher pitch, which results in lower dominance and lower attractiveness.
I wouldn't do that if I were you.
Okay, and then this is low pitch, which results in high dominance and high attractiveness.
I wouldn't do that if I were you.
Okay, so hopefully you can tell the difference there. Unfortunately, vocal pitch didn't have a significant effect on ratings of trustworthiness. So for trustworthiness, we used a median split instead and created a high and a low trustworthiness group. And I can play some examples. So this is low trustworthiness.
I wouldn't do that if I were you.
And this is high trustworthiness.
I wouldn't do that if I were you.
Okay. So in the study, we used all different face and voice combinations. So participants could be presented with an attractive face with an attractive voice, or attractive face with an unattractive voice, and so on. The actual task was very straightforward. Participants could see a face and hear a voice at the same time, and they were just asked to rate each person for trustworthiness, dominance, and attractiveness using a scale from 1 to 9. So, what did we find? Our results showed that both face and voice cues influenced the audiovisual judgment significantly, and there was no interaction between them, meaning that their effects were somewhat additive in nature, so they were quite independent. For all traits, the combination of both face and voice low in trustworthiness, dominance, and attractiveness received the lowest overall ratings, whereas the combination of face and voice both high in those traits received the highest overall rating. So no surprises there. But the critical comparison is between the two mismatch conditions, where we have a face high on trustworthiness, dominance, or attractiveness paired with a voice that's low on these traits, or the other way around. And here we see a similar pattern of results for ratings of trustworthiness and attractiveness, where the pairs with high face trustworthiness and attractiveness received higher overall ratings, meaning that the effect of the face here was stronger than the effect of the voice. This was also reflected in our statistical results, so you can have a look at the effect sizes here. The effect of the face is much stronger than the effect of the voice. For dominance, however, we found the complete opposite pattern. So here we had higher overall ratings attributed to voices high in dominance, not faces high in dominance, meaning that for judgments of dominance, the voice had a stronger relative importance than the face. And again, this is very obvious when looking at the effect sizes. So here the numbers are pretty much reversed. So this answers our first question. When presented with both auditory and visual information simultaneously, information from both modalities contributes significantly to our first impressions. However, their relative importance seems to depend on the trait. We see that the physical information from the face is more important for the perception of trustworthiness and attractiveness, whereas the acoustic information from the voice is more important for the perception of dominance. Now, these are some interesting results, but we wanted to learn a bit more about the integration between visual and auditory information in first impressions. And so in the second study, we decided to test whether there is some evidence that face and voice cues are automatically integrated together. In this study, we specifically focused on the perception of dominance and used the exact same stimuli in the same task as before, but to investigate the automaticity of audiovisual integration, we split our participants into two groups. Each group was presented with the same face and voice pairs, but one group was specifically instructed to only focus on the information coming from the face when making their judgment, whereas the other group was specifically instructed to only focus on the information coming from the voice. This way, we would be able to tell whether the modality that was meant to be ignored could still influence our participants' judgment, which would provide some evidence that auditory and visual cues were integrated automatically together. So as in the first study, we found that both the effects of the face and the voice were significant and that there was no interaction between them, but participants in the two instruction groups also behaved differently from one another. So we can have a look at the data separately here for each group. So when participants were specifically instructed to focus on the information coming from the face, we see that the effect of the face is much stronger. So on the graph here, this is represented by the huge gap between those two lines. This is the effect of the face. And this was great because it shows that participants were able to follow our instructions. But we also see that those two lines there are not completely horizontal, which is what we would expect if participants were completely able to ignore the information coming from the voice. So this gives us an indication that participants still took the information coming from the voice into consideration when making their dominance decision. When participants were specifically asked to focus on the information coming from the voice, the effect of the voice is much stronger, which here is represented by the difference between those 2 points here and these 2 points here. So it's a stronger effect. But we also see that there's a little gap between the two lines, and this is the effect of the face. So again, participants were able to follow our instructions, but we see that they were not able to completely ignore the information coming from the face. So with this, we answer our second question. Since our participants were not able to completely ignore the information coming from either the face or the voice, even when specifically instructed to do so, this gives us some evidence that auditory and visual cues are integrated automatically together when forming a first impression. Now, while these studies provide us with important information about audiovisual integration, there is one other aspect of first impressions that can tell us about the general face and voice processing mechanisms, and that's within person variability, or the variability in social ratings of different images or voice recordings of the same person. Now, this is something that has been mostly ignored in the literature, where usually one person is represented by a single image or a single voice recording. So let's take this image for an example here. If we see this image of this person, chances are we'll have quite a favorable impression of them. But what if I show you all of these other images of the same person? It very quickly becomes obvious that the same person can be perceived very, very differently. So, to explore this idea further, our final study compared the variability in social ratings of face images and voice recordings belonging to the same person, so within person variability, with the variability in social ratings of images and voice recordings belonging to different people, so also called between person variability. To do that, we used a set of 200 short video clips. These were 10 different videos of 20 different identities. All of them were Bulgarian celebrities who were unfamiliar to our UK participants. And I can play a few examples for you. So these are all the same person. This is video number 1. Number 2. And number 3. Okay, so hopefully you can tell there's a lot of variability there. Participants were presented with the muted video clips in the visual condition, or with the audio recording extracted from the videos in the auditory condition, and were asked to rate each person for trustworthiness, dominance, and attractiveness. We then measured both within and between person variability in these ratings separately for faces and voices, and we found quite a difference between the two modalities. So for faces, we saw more within person variability for ratings of trustworthiness, equal within and between person variability for ratings of dominance, and more between person variability for ratings of attractiveness. So the relationship between the two types of variability was different for each of the main traits. For voices, however, we see a much more consistent pattern with within person variability consistently exceeding between person variability for all three traits. So what this means is that first impressions based on voice recordings and face images of the same person vary just as much or even more than ratings attributed to images and recordings of different people, with the only exception being attractiveness as judged from the human face. And this can tell us something important about the link between faces and identity on one side and voices and identity on the other side. So the fact that there is consistently more variability in ratings of different voice recordings of the same person than recordings of different people suggests that the link between identity and faces might be much stronger than the link between voices and identity. And what is more, if we compare the three underlying traits, we find that attractiveness, as judged from the human face, is the most stable first impression and the one that is most closely related to identity, because ratings of attractiveness were the only ones that could be used to discriminate between different identities. So, to quickly sum up, both faces and voices are important for first impressions, but when integrated together, the information from the face is relatively more important for judgments of trustworthiness and attractiveness, whereas the information from the voice is more important for judgments of dominance. I've also shown you some evidence that auditory and visual cues are integrated somewhat automatically, even when a static face is paired with a dynamic voice. And finally, there is large within person variability in first impressions based on both faces and voices, except for face attractiveness, which appears to carry the most stable identity signal. Okay, so this is all from me. I hope you found it interesting. I'd like to thank all of my wonderful collaborators and thank you for listening.